years ago now, the literary critic Steve Donahue described Jane Austen's work as a party that everyone's invited to. If you're not at the party yet, maybe your invitation got lost in the mail, maybe you took a wrong turn on your way there, but there's a big party happening and you're definitely invited. My name is Jennifer. I've studied books, reviewed them, sold them mostly to foreign markets, including the UK, interesting market, and still the thought has crossed my mind, what right do I have to make a Jane Austen video? Because unlike some of the other literature I discuss here, I'm not an Austen specialist and I can't offer as much as a specialist could. That's just how knowledge works. Here's where I'm coming from, ultimately. The best thing about books is the experience of reading them. It's that time when it's you and the book. And often it's the books that are the most famous that we stop talking about as reading experiences. I love that Jane Austen stories are embedded in popular culture. I love how influential the adaptations of her novels are. I mean, Colin Firth could win as many Oscars as he wanted for the rest of his life, and if you handed me a picture of him on my deathbed, I'd be like, oh, that's Mr. Darcy. And I also love academic or academic style examinations of Austen's work, isolating one element, like estate inheritance or elopements. But the way you encounter these stories in their original form is to read them. And there are all these quirks to Austen's writing that make reading her kind of an odd, singular experience. These quirks are the party, is what I'm saying. So it's simple. I'm going to take you through these 6 special novels and talk about the things that stood out to me the most this time on these rereads, because as the years go on, they become more and more alive in your hands. It's amazing. Rereading great books is such a perk of aging. Like, I've been thinking a lot recently about how lucky I feel whenever I get the chance to re-encounter something I've loved. And if you're new to Jane Austen, or relatively new, this is what I honestly think whenever anyone tells me they haven't read a specific classic. You get to read that book for the first time. If you're out there and you haven't read Pride and Prejudice yet, you get to read that book for the first time. Don't overthink it. That's the basic, beautiful truth of it. And I'm going to be talking about these books in a way that doesn't assume that everyone has read them. I'm taking you all with me. Now, I associate each one of these novels with a certain color palette. The way they feel translates into something I can see when I close my eyes and think of them. So in this video, we're going to be going from the lightest book, palette-wise, to the darkest, which mostly works chronologically in this case, from the earlier, breezier, snappier books to the ones that are a little richer and more somber. Let's do this. I want to linger on the first few pages of Sense and Sensibility because they are packed with information. You know the show Don't Tell principle? This is a clear exception. Jane is telling us. We're introduced to a man named Mr. Henry Dashwood, who has a son by a previous marriage and 3 daughters from his current one. So already there are 2 words appearing before us. Inheritance rights. We're told that Mr. Henry Dashwood's son, John, is already well positioned financially, but that the 3 girls from the second marriage will have very little to inherit contractually at the present moment. And what happens is that 3 Dashwood men in turn don't really think through the worst case scenario for the women in the family. So when Henry Dashwood dies suddenly, the girls aren't left with very much contractually, which is why on his deathbed, Henry Dashwood asks his son, John, to provide for the wife and daughters of this second marriage. Here's where we get some important information about John. He was not an ill-disposed young man, unless to be rather cold-hearted and rather selfish is to be ill-disposed, but he was in general well-respected, for he conducted himself with propriety in the discharge of his ordinary duties. I love this fleeting insight that most people think well of him because his worst qualities only become clear on close acquaintance, and in the end, it's pretty easy for his more narrow-minded and selfish wife to convince him to do the absolute bare minimum for his half-sisters. So we're introduced to their troubles first, and then to the women themselves, and notice how deliberately the narrator shapes our understanding of them. Eleanor possessed a strength of understanding and a coolness of judgment which qualified her, though only 19, to be the counselor of her mother. She had an excellent heart. Her disposition was affectionate, and her feelings were strong, but she knew how to govern them. It was a knowledge which her mother had yet to learn, and which one of her sisters had resolved never to be taught. Marianne's abilities were in many respects quite equal to Eleanor's. She was sensible and clever, but eager in everything. Her sorrows, her joys could have no moderation. She was generous, amiable, interesting. She was everything but prudent. There you have it. Eleanor is the master of her emotions, and Marianne's emotions are the master of her. put a pin in that, a large, brightly colored pin. I've already said that this opening chapter is mostly a case of telling, not showing, but that's only partly true. What we're being shown throughout is the character of the narrator, who is, I would argue, the most obtrusive narrator of any of Austen's novels. So Eleanor, Marianne, Margaret, and their mother are essentially forced out of their home while they're still grieving, and they end up moving several hours away to a much smaller house, a cottage. And as we progress, both Eleanor and Marianne have their own love stories. Marianne's is a love triangle with a passionate younger man named John Willoughby, and a slightly older, more restrained man named Colonel Brandon. And both these men have pasts with a capital P that rhymes with T that stands for trouble. Eleanor's love story is less tempestuous, but it is fraught because it's with a man named Edward Ferrars, whose sister is Eleanor's dreaded, selfish sister-in-law. Eleanor spends the majority of the book thinking that Edward cares for her, but never being completely sure because there are things he's not telling her. And of course, these things come out. So in both sisters' storylines, there's this question of how well you can truly know someone within a typical courtship period. Questions of what is and isn't immediately observable. And there are cases in this book of people being both overestimated and underestimated. One of the most interesting cases on a more metatextual level is with a middle-aged family friend named Mrs. Jennings, who is a certain kind of Austen archetype that you'll notice if you read several of her books. The narrator makes fun of her constantly, calls her an everlasting talker and insipid. I always love seeing where the word insipid appears in Austen's books. And she sticks her nose in everybody's business, that kind of thing. But near the end of the book, when things take a turn for the worse, Mrs. Jennings proves herself to be a true and loving person through and through, and the narrator is finally compelled to give her an unironic stamp of approval. Okay, let's take that pin out. Let's return to the way these sisters are portrayed, starting with some self-disclosure here. When I first read this as a teenager, I would have described it as a story of two sisters. I then read it twice more, once in my early 20s and again in my mid-20s, and at that point I had a vague sense that Eleanor was maybe getting some preferential treatment. This time, I was hit full in the face by how unambiguously this is Eleanor's book. This isn't the merits of sense and the merits of sensibility. It's the merits of sense and the impulsive, inconvenient foolhardiness of sensibility. It's the most English framing of the world imaginable. I have a sister. We also have two brothers, but I don't know, my childhood really made me think they were narratively useless to me. Would have cashed them in for two more sisters in a heartbeat. As adults, broadly speaking, I'm more like Eleanor and my sister is a lot more like Marianne. So I'm not proud of this. But I think the main reason I didn't clock the very obvious worldview of this book is that portraying Eleanor as more reasonable seemed reasonable to me, which is wild because on this reread, I felt defensive on Marianne's behalf a lot of the time. I was like, okay, we get it. Eleanor is perfect, and Marianne won't be perfect until she becomes more like Eleanor. That's not to say the criticism is unfounded or not completely unfounded. I accept the narrator's assessment that there are plenty of times when Eleanor is justified in thinking, could you all please just keep it together? And it must be said, the most powerful scene in the novel is when Eleanor confronts Marianne about Marianne's assumption that because Eleanor doesn't show her feelings, they must not be as strong. I think more reserved people the world over will find Eleanor's response to that vindicating. But in general, even though the sisters are very close and very generous with each other, the narrative preference is extreme. I started using shorthand in my notes. MEW for more Eleanor worship, and MMC for more Marianne condemnation. And what's unusual here is the degree of this, that Eleanor's perspective and the narrator's are almost perfectly aligned, such that Eleanor acts as the voice of authority, in a way. One of the love interests does as well, actually, to a lesser extent, but it's really Eleanor's speech and behavior and perceptions that are treated as correct, while those of others are not to be fully trusted. And I'll leave a breadcrumb here to say that there's one character in another Austen novel who functions in this same way. If you know her books, see if you can guess who it is. Now, it's also true that these imperfections of Marianne's mean that she has a lot more room to grow, so her character arc is more dynamic than Eleanor's. I thought for a moment there that there was a real lesson that Eleanor was learning as well, but I think the narrator disagreed with me on that. When Mrs. Dashwood finally understands how strong Eleanor's feelings are for Edward, she's completely taken aback. She found that she had been misled by the careful, the considerate attention of her daughter. She feared that Marianne's affliction, because more acknowledged, more immediately before her, had too much engrossed her tenderness. and led her away to forget that in Eleanor she might have a daughter suffering almost as much. See, this is what fascinates me. This interaction apparently is being used as an example of how Eleanor's mother could be more aware. It's not being used as a lesson that Eleanor should confide in someone. There's no contemporary advice of, you can't outthink your feelings, be vulnerable with those you love, your feelings are not a burden. This narrator is having none of it. And on this reread, the theme of proper versus improper expressions of emotion is what really made me notice what is and is not admitted into this worldview. In a creative writing class years ago, we did an exercise where we were asked to write one sentence, just any random sentence, and to put it on the board. And it's funny, there's a sentence that one of my classmates wrote that I still remember. It was, what she hated most about the place was probably the fireflies. And seeing that sentence on the board made me see the value in the whole exercise because it was already a worldview. It locks you into a specific perspective. In literature, when the writing is typed, like it is in that sentence, it's almost like you can feel your mind click into perspective, and that's when you're in. That's when the narrative has you. Austen locks you in, typically within a sentence, always within a paragraph. And because her writing is doing all this work seemingly effortlessly, I find that I have to make more of an effort to separate myself and notice where the narrator has taken me. In this case, from the first chapter, we have a clear privileging of quiet grief over demonstrative grief. And it's worth noting just how culturally specific that judgment is. If you haven't read Austen before, you're in for some of the iciest one-liners of your life. My favorite happens during a conversation between Eleanor and her brother John. After he's been speaking at length, we get this. Eleanor agreed to it all, for she did not think he deserved the compliment of rational opposition. I've since had many an interaction where I've asked myself, now, is this worth the compliment of rational opposition? And a great line of the more serious variety comes toward the end of the book when one of the chapters opens like this. Eleanor now found the difference between the expectation of an unpleasant event, however certain the mind may be told to consider it, and certainty itself. Overall, this is one of Austen's most fun and opinionated and buoyant books, even though it begins in this heavy way with such heavy misfortunes. I don't know, I've always felt that there's this freshness and vivacity to Sense and Sensibility, especially in Marianne's storylines. And I still love Eleanor too, and I am on her wavelength, but there are some things you can't unsee once you're no longer stupendously biased enough to miss them. Now we come to Pride and Prejudice. I didn't make you wait long, here it is, Austen's best book. Hardly a controversial opinion, but yeah, it felt indisputable this time around. Every element of this book sings. It's not my favorite of hers, we're saving that for later, but if it's your favorite, it's impossible to argue with that. With Sense and Sensibility, we opened with matter-of-fact descriptions of the characters and their circumstances. With Pride and Prejudice, we open with a conversation. Well, first, there's the famous line, "It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife." We know this is actually a hope universally held by mothers with too many daughters. But we quickly transition to an exchange between a husband and wife, Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, which establishes the dynamics of an unhappy couple. In a book about marriage, this is our introduction to marriage. Even though this conversation isn't about them, it's about a young man coming into town, we understand implicitly that these are the stakes. Our heroine has grown up in this environment, has witnessed her parents' unwise, unequal, caustic partnership, and she knows it's the last thing she wants for herself. Our heroine is, of course, Elizabeth Bennet. She's the second of 5 daughters. On her father's death, his estate will go to a distant male cousin, leaving his immediate family with very little. Here we are again. Elizabeth and her older sister Jane are considered the most promising daughters in the family when it comes to the marriage market, especially Jane because she's the most beautiful. And the family's long-term plan for how they will maintain themselves is for one of their daughters, probably Jane, to marry well. But this is also a story about the practicality of marrying for love, if you can manage it. Jane and Elizabeth are both determined, practically speaking, to do the opposite of what their parents did, to find partners who suit them and whom they can respect. So it's a big deal early in the book when they attend a ball and they meet two new faces in the neighborhood, two handsome and rich young men. Charles Bingley shows a clear preference for Jane, and his friend Fitzwilliam Darcy shows a clear aversion to Elizabeth. This is one of those famous early scenes when Bingley sees that Elizabeth is sitting off to the side of the dance floor and he suggests that Darcy ask her to dance. This is how Darcy responds. "She is tolerable, but not handsome enough to tempt me, and I am in no humor at present to give consequence to young ladies who are slighted by other men." God, I know these lines so well, and they're still unreal. Basically, Mr. Darcy is so unpleasant and standoffish that the whole neighborhood leaves the ball with the impression that he's the most stuck-up man on earth. I first read Pride and Prejudice in my 10th grade English class, and our initial class discussion was a watershed moment for me because I remember our teacher asking us why Elizabeth kept speaking so definitively about Mr. Darcy, why she didn't find anything about him likable. So I raised my hand and said, because he didn't want to dance with her. And I was surprised when my teacher agreed because it seemed too simple. I hadn't read many classics at that age, and I assumed that classics meant complicated. So to see this basic element of human nature on display, one that was like too relevant at age 16, whether or not someone wanted to dance with you, I don't know, it made me want to read more widely in general. Shout out to Mrs. Pearsall, amazing teacher. Culturally, Elizabeth Bennet is Jane Austen's most iconic character. We're told that she has a lively, playful disposition which delighted in anything ridiculous, so she's like our narrator. She's quick-witted, level-headed. She's a real individual, but still within the bounds of respectability. And most importantly, she's a student of other people's characters, and she believes herself to be a good student on this subject. But here's the key thing. Narratively, she's actually a mixture of Eleanor and Marianne, because we're often meant to trust her perceptions, but the narrator sets her up for certain realizations about the limits of those perceptions. Elizabeth and Jane's relationship is one of the best parts of the story because in some ways, they're like the loving version of their parents' dynamic. Their conversations are this duet of Jane's earnestness and Elizabeth's teasing. I love their sister scenes. And neither of them functions exactly like Eleanor does. There are times when Elizabeth is more correct about somebody because she's more attuned to people's negative qualities, but there are also key instances when it turns out that Jane is more right about somebody because she's disposed to think well of people. And I hadn't remembered it that way. Pride and Prejudice has such a flow to it. It's the peak example of something that Austen does consistently, which is to use changes in rhythm to maintain the energy of the narration. She mixes up her usage of direct and reported speech. Mrs. Bennet gets a lot of direct speech without commentary, giving her maximum rope to hang herself with. Sometimes Austen opts for granular detail where we're getting every expression and gesture and every flicker of feeling, but at other times she glosses over details and withholds information to a maddening degree. One of the funniest things about this book is that it has maybe the two most excruciating proposal scenes ever. Elizabeth Bennet gets not one, but two of the worst proposals imaginable. And then when she finally gets a good one, we don't get to hear it. Oh, we get the scene, but we're not placed fully in the scene. At a key moment, we don't get to hear what they actually say to each other. And this coyness is a common Austen technique. Prepare yourself. There's a line about halfway through this story that is the moment of this novel, and maybe of all her novels. Elizabeth receives a letter with crucial information about various people, information she was missing before. And this knowledge transforms her view of others and of herself because suddenly her own biases are uncomfortably clear. And she says, "Till this moment, I never knew myself." This is the fundamental quality of an Austen protagonist. It's the ability to engage in serious, unflattering self-insight. We're talking conscious acknowledgement that you've changed your mind, you've misbehaved, you misjudged something, you mistreated someone. To be frank, I know people in real life who are potentially incapable of the things I just mentioned. And I think it's a subliminal, soothing element of a Jane Austen novel that you're placed in the minds of people who are capable of maturing. Which leads me back to Mr. Darcy, because here's something you might not know or might not remember about these books. The narrators leap in and out of different characters' minds. At one point I was doing some work for a literary agency, you know, the kind of work where you're paid an experience and told how grateful you should be. They gave us this handbook defining basic literary terms, and the example sentence they gave us for the term perspective was, Pride and Prejudice is told from the perspective of Elizabeth Bennet. So I think a reread is in order for that literary professional, because the narrator flits all over the place. We do get Elizabeth's thoughts throughout, but especially in the first part of the book, we get so many moments behind Mr. Darcy's eyes while he's falling for her. Here's a taste of that. Occupied in observing Mr. Bingley's attentions to her sister, Elizabeth was far from suspecting that she was herself becoming an object of some interest in the eyes of his friend. Mr. Darcy had at first scarcely allowed her to be pretty. He had looked at her without admiration at the ball, and when they next met, he looked at her only to criticize. But no sooner had he made it clear to himself and his friends that she had hardly a good feature in her face, than he began to find it was rendered uncommonly intelligent by the beautiful expression of her dark eyes. To this discovery succeeded some others equally mortifying. And I know that the TV and movie adaptations are the reason for this book's romantic reputation, at least currently, but when you read it, it's that access to both leads that makes everything feel so romantically vibrant. And at a certain point, we lose that access to Darcy's mind so that we're now placed in the same position as Elizabeth and can only guess what he's thinking. So I've talked about some of the themes and rhythms and relationships of Pride and Prejudice, but the thing that sets it apart the most, in my estimation, is that it has the most complete set of characters, and I don't think many other novels match it in this respect. Two of those characters especially stood out to me this time. One of them is a man named Colonel Fitzwilliam. He's this kind of random man who only shows up in one section of the story. He has this mild romantic chemistry with Elizabeth. Elizabeth has love on the mind, generally. And Colonel Fitzwilliam plays unexpected parts in several pivotal scenes. I honestly barely remembered this man, and I was like, Colonel Fitzwilliam showing up. And the second is my enduring favorite character, Mr. Bennet. I used to think he was presented favorably to us because of his barbed humor and the way that he feels so exasperated by other people's stupidity and his preference for Elizabeth because of her intellect. But the narrator criticizes and even condemns him a lot more than I recalled. I just think there are very few people out there who wouldn't enjoy this book. You know when you go outside on a beautiful day, like the kind of day where regardless of anything that's happening with you, the air itself is just filled with the vigor and brightness of life. Mentally, that's what reading Pride and Prejudice is like. It's like a sunny, breezy day in your brain. There were multiple scenes where I smiled to myself the whole time. I smiled for pages. And I know I'm an American, but I'm not too prone to that generally. This is where a lot of people start with Austen, and for good reason. Honestly, I think it's kind of fitting that we have this more like shadowy lighting for the next book, which is one that is making fun of Gothic novels. Those of you who love Northanger Abbey might have to be a little more vocal in the comments because I don't love this book. I like it a lot, I really do. But I think those of you who feel that love for it are going to want to advocate for it in a different way than I can. We begin delightfully. Here's our first sentence. No one who had ever seen Catherine Morland in her infancy would have supposed her born to be a heroine. I love this part about her mother that says she was a woman of useful, plain sense, with a good temper, and what is more remarkable, with a good constitution. She had 3 sons before Catherine was born, and instead of dying and bringing the latter into the world as anybody might expect, she still lived on. The narrator is having a lot of fun with this, saying, well, there's no way you can be the heroine of a novel if your family is normal. Catherine is also plain to the extent that as she gets a little older and her appearance starts improving and her parents give her compliments like, she is almost pretty today. She's thrilled by that praise. She's like, oh, almost pretty. And then we get the critical detail. Catherine Morland is a voracious reader of sensational novels. When she gets asked by a family friend to go to the city of Bath with her for the social season, Catherine is sure that this is the time in her life when things will actually start happening to her like they do to book characters. So as you can guess, at every turn the narrator is making fun of poor Catherine and the gap between the train and the platform, between her expectations and her reality. There's a key phrase that's dropped in the middle of a sentence. The common feelings of common life. This is what Austen wants to portray, and it's what will go on to interest her in all her other fiction. So for example, when Catherine and this family friend, Mrs. Allen, arrive at their first ball, Catherine is aflutter with possibility. A ballroom seems like the dreamiest setting in the world. but actually it's just hot and crowded and they don't know anybody. Which, yes, I'm sure I'm the life of the party until I get there and there's a little too much life happening. I have to take a moment to mention the third-degree burns that Mrs. Allen sustains in this book. There's this early gem. Mrs. Allen was one of that numerous class of females whose society can raise no other emotion than surprise at there being any men in the world who could like them well enough to marry them. And 30 pages later, we're treated to a whole paragraph on Mrs. Allen's vacancy of mind and incapacity for thinking, leaving the wreckage of Mrs. Allen on the side of the road. A more intriguing character is Isabella Thorpe, who becomes Catherine's first friend in Bath. And we're told from the beginning that they formed this friendship really quickly. The narrator calls it a sudden intimacy. And it's understandable because Isabella is 4 years older than Catherine. She's beautiful, so it's a sort of thrill to be associated with her, you know? She's warm and chatty, really takes Catherine under her wing, and the two of them both love dramatic novels. As readers become more acquainted with Isabella, the alarm bells get louder. She consistently says one thing and does another, and it takes a while for lovely, literal Catherine to pick up on this. It's this recurring theme that just because certain people seem open doesn't mean that you know them well. And actually, as we saw in Sense and Sensibility, and as we'll see again in the Jane Austen universe, often the quickest intimacies are the shortest. It's implied that it's wise to wait before sharing your inner life with somebody. And actually there's a character who in this exact respect acts as Isabella's foil in this book. I usually don't read the introductions to these volumes, not because they're not valuable, I'm sure they are, but because I never did when I was younger, and then I sort of naturally developed my own familiarity with these stories. But after this reread, I did go through Robert Keeley's introduction in here because I wanted more context on all the reading commentary. There are these moments when the narrator breaks from the story, seemingly both to criticize and to defend the novel as a form, and Keeley does a wonderful job of making sense of some of these finer distinctions. He explains that in this early 19th century period, there were a number of popular novelists whose own morals were questioned because of the content of their fiction. Glad we solved that problem in the meantime. These were typically histrionic novels that were meant to exaggerate reality instead of representing it. So Keeley frames this as Jane Austen bringing the techniques of intelligent dialogue to bear on the excesses of romantic fiction. She wasn't entirely reductive and dismissive about this kind of fiction and these authors, but neither did she admire them, primarily because she felt so strongly that there was this greater power in more realistic fiction that treated language with more care. So Catherine is set on a path of learning to recognize what Keeley calls the excesses of an untutored imagination. Her favorite books don't, like, ruin her, but neither do they improve her mind in the way that more honest fiction can, from Austen's perspective. Something that sets Northanger Abbey apart is that we get more descriptions of nature, and especially of interiors in here, because the second half of the novel is set at an abbey, and Austen is poking fun at the vapid conventions of Gothic novels. Nowhere else in her work do we linger to this extent on these sorts of details of place, and I like that about this novel, that through Austen's imitation of a different genre, I did feel more grounded in the Abbey than I have in her other settings. At the same time, it's a reminder of why I'm not sorry that this is a one-off, because it's not her strength. She creates atmosphere in other ways, you know, most prominently with dialogue. At heart, Austen's just less interested in non-human surroundings. I grew up in the suburbs. I don't know the names of, like, plants and animals and trees. I can't identify living things, okay? So this is an aspect of Austen's work that I've always appreciated. Some other strengths of this novel, before we get to my qualms, because we are getting there, I do really like the descriptions of the Moreland family as just this, like, ordinary, close group of people. And through Catherine's interactions with her brother, I realized that there aren't a lot of brothers in these novels, and those that are present tend to be family disappointments in some way, which is funny because Jane Austen herself had 6 brothers and 1 sister, so I think we know who her favorite sibling was just by reading her books. It's nice to see a brother and sister in this story who just like each other, where nothing is complicated and no one is at risk of being disowned. I also appreciate Catherine as a protagonist. I don't always appreciate how she functions in the story, and we'll get to that, but on her own, she's just an upbeat, unassuming girl who's on the brink of becoming a more sensible woman, you know? And you feel that more and more as the story goes on, that in spite of all the narrator's irony at Catherine's expense, being good-natured and thinking kindly of other people actually are special qualities in a person. Maybe not in a heroine, but definitely in an everyday person. As I alluded to, I think that people who tend to process the world more literally will see that in her, because it takes her a while to process that people can think one thing and say another. It's that way with Isabella, and then in a scene where a character is being obviously hyperbolic, Catherine doesn't understand this and she starts to panic at what he's saying. Later in the book, there's also a moment when she sees another character in a new light and she thinks, how were people at this rate to be understood? On the whole, though, the naivete of this protagonist creates a weirdly uneven dynamic between Catherine and her love interest and Catherine and the narrator. Henry Tilney is described as a very gentlemanlike young man who, if not quite handsome, was very near it. And we're told that there was an archness and pleasantry in his manner which interested, though it was hardly understood by Catherine. Basically, within a few sentences of their meeting, we already know their relationship is a lopsided one. Henry Tilney is older than she is, he's been out and about in society, he can talk circles around her if he so chooses. At one point, the narrator tells us that Catherine is fearful of hazarding an opinion in opposition to that of a self-assured man, which in this case is less a reflection of her and more a reflection of just how horrible this specific man is. A lot of this has shades of Dostoevsky's The Idiot, which was published 50 years after Northanger Abbey. But its core premise is, what would happen if I took a good man and put him in St. Petersburg? How would he process the wretchedness of this society? And how would wretched people react to him? That is to say, Catherine's purity is meant to function in contrast to others' insincerity. Given the context, I understand Catherine's intentionally imbalanced love story, and even on the level of the characters as individuals, Tilney is, a wry, lighthearted sort of person, but he's also aware of the feelings of others, so these many moments when he gets something and Catherine doesn't, they don't feel ugly. It's just not how other Austen novels work. One of the real pleasures of an Austen novel is that the male protagonist and the female protagonist are well matched, regardless of their exact circumstances and of the different degrees of social and economic power that they each wield. Individually, as humans, they are equals, and instinctively the reader senses this. So to read an Austen novel where the romantic leads are consistently characterized as unequal, I'm sorry, regardless of the exact reason for it, I don't enjoy it as much. And this isn't just true with Henry Tilney. The archness of an Austen narrator doesn't land in the same way when the lead is this clueless, even with other leading ladies who are set up for a fall, like Elizabeth Bennet and Emma Woodhouse and Marianne Dashwood. They're all generally quick enough to be in on the general joke of life. With Catherine, baby girl is left out of every joke on every narrative level. And the thing is, this book has always felt to me like a first novel. It was one of the last of her books that I read, and I think that's pretty common. As with Men's Tennis, there's a big four. Yes, I count Andy Murray. But when I first read Northanger Abbey, I saw that it had been published after her death in 1818, and I was like, I could have sworn that this was the debut. Lo and behold, I later found out that it was the first book that she wrote. You can tell. Especially in the later stages in the Abbey, things begin to feel not just quick, but also rushed. Characters jump to certain conclusions for narrative convenience. Some of the one-liners from the narrator aren't as sharp as they are elsewhere. And let's be honest, the book is an extended shtick, an entertaining one, but a shtick nonetheless. Some people say this is their favorite Austen, and I know that a favorite book and a best book are often, separate concepts. And still, I don't understand how Northanger Abbey can be somebody's favorite Austen. Do you love yourself? If this is your favorite, please represent yourself and tell us why. And I'm sorry I'm such a naysayer. What I will acknowledge is that this mostly suffers in my mind because it's an Austen book. It suffers in comparison, For most authors, this would be their best book. This would be the one classic from them that we still read. I know I just did a good amount of bashing there, but if a friend told me that they were interested in reading Northanger Abbey, I'd say, you're gonna have a great time. Even Austen at her worst is this fun and this good. Now we get to what might be Austen's most polarizing book, and that is Emma. The critical consensus is that this is one of her best books, if not her best, and I mostly agree. For me, it's second only to Pride and Prejudice. But readers I know have had a range of experiences with this one, mostly because our main character, by design, is a spoiled brat, and I love it. The way that some readers gravitate toward horror because in some sense they enjoy the feeling of fear, as a reader, I sort of enjoy the feeling of frustration. And Austen is in such imperious control of her books that if you're feeling irritated, it's probably because you're meant to, and it's a sort of perverse delight. I think of Emma as Austen's most complete protagonist. She is tasked with carrying this story, and she does it with aplomb. Here's how we begin. Emma Woodhouse, handsome, clever, and rich, with a comfortable home and happy disposition, seemed to unite some of the best blessings of existence, and had lived nearly 21 years in the world with very little to distress or vex her. The real evils, indeed, of Emma's situation were the power of having rather too much of her own way, and a disposition to think a little too well of herself. The danger, however, was at present so unperceived that they did not by any means rank as misfortunes with her. Already, less than a page in, we know so much, including the heroine's trajectory within the story. The evils in Emma Woodhouse's life are minor and internal. She's not gonna face major external adversity, but the two most important words on this page are at present. We're told that Emma has some faults, but the book doesn't say they're unperceived by her, it says they're unperceived at present, meaning that this is our starting point, and we're about to have the painful pleasure of some self-discovery. The Woodhouses live on a village estate called Hartfield. We are in the countryside, and within their own small social circle, they're second to none, largely because there are no other young people of Emma's class in the area. At the beginning of the story, Emma's longtime governess marries and leaves Hartfield, and it's around this time, when Emma has lost her daily companion of many years, that three other characters enter the scene, all of them around her age. One is a young woman named Harriet Smith who's attending a local school, and Emma takes a liking to her and makes her particular friend. Poor Harriet. This is mostly where the famous matchmaker storylines come into play. Emma wants to make a match for Harriet, and some seriously uncomfortable misunderstandings ensue. Then there's a handsome devil named Frank Churchill who's been long expected at his father's estate in the neighborhood, and because of his family connections, it's hoped that he and Emma will, form an attachment. That phrase feels especially weird to say with an American accent. Form an attachment. Finally, and most intriguingly, I think, we meet Jane Fairfax, who comes to the village to live with her aunts until she can find work as a governess. Jane is lovely, she's elegant, and she plays the piano much better than Emma does. That's kind of the main point, at least at first. Emma acknowledges that Jane is in some ways her superior, and that's not an everyday acknowledgement for her. At the same time, everyone is aware that the two have very different situations in life. Jane's is far from enviable, and Emma's is entirely enviable. I mean, look, you start talking about Emma Woodhouse and the sun comes out. I last read this when I was a teenager, and there was something I didn't fully process then that was at the forefront of my mind this time, long before the book brought it up. Of all the young women in Austen's work, Emma is the only one who is completely secure when she's single. When we first meet her, she already has all the practical advantages of a married woman, meaning she has nothing to gain from marriage other than love. I myself can't even claim the same. Like, it would be great for somebody to pay half my Wi-Fi bill. She's rich, she loves her home, and she runs her home, a home filled with servants, some of whom even get named in this book, unlike in most of the others. So she already has a perfect balance of freedom and comfort. She has close relationships with her friends and family, almost all of whom live close by. She has status in her community, admiration, respect. She's living the dream from page one. And the fact that she's beautiful isn't discussed in the context of her prospects on the marriage market like it is for Jane Bennet. She gets to be beautiful and charming and fairly accomplished in her own context. We're told these things just to show that it's nice to be Emma Woodhouse, not because they'll be necessary to improve her situation in life. It's striking to read. Emma's luck is that it's most blatant when compared with the life of Jane Fairfax's aunt, Miss Bates. I want to leave this storyline mostly untouched because for me it's the heart of the book and I find it very moving, but this is how we're introduced to her. She had never boasted either beauty or cleverness. Her youth had passed without distinction, and her middle of life was devoted to the care of a failing mother and the endeavor to make a small income go as far as possible. and yet she was a happy woman, and a woman whom no one named without goodwill. It was her own universal goodwill and contented temper which worked such wonders. She loved everybody, was interested in everybody's happiness, quick-sighted to everybody's merits, thought herself a most fortunate creature. And it's just as well that we're given this context because Miss Bates is a talker. If you flip through and randomly see a wall of text, you know it's Miss Bates, and it is a lot for Emma and for the reader. There's a scene where in the middle of another stream of chatter, Miss Bates actually says something that Emma would do well to hear. One never does form a just idea of anybody beforehand. One takes up a notion and runs away with it. But you know that Emma isn't paying attention because, I mean, it's difficult to do so. And also, she doesn't think she has anything to learn from Miss Bates. And ultimately, her most humbling moment comes when she's unkind to this humble woman. If you were waiting for the love interest, here he is, Mr. George Knightley. The situation here is that Mr. Knightley is already close to the whole Woodhouse family. His younger brother is married to Emma's older sister. He goes over to Hartfield to spend time with Mr. Woodhouse and Emma most days already. So the two of them are close friends and completely familiar with each other when the book begins. Now, remember, in the Sense and Sensibility portion, I mentioned that there was another Eleanor-like character coming down the pike. Here he is. In the narrator's estimation, Mr. Knightley's judgment is pretty much faultless. Within a page of meeting him, we're told that he was one of the few people who could see faults in Emma Woodhouse, and the only one who ever told her of them. Mr. Knightley is the only one to voice concerns about Emma's friendship with Harriet, concerns for both women, and yeah, these things do come to pass. He also drops some iconic truth bombs. At one point he tells Emma, "Men of sense, no matter what you may choose to say, do not want silly wives." And he notes that although another male character is a ridiculous human, when it comes to choosing a wife, he may talk sentimentally, but he will act rationally. And what do you know, soon after that point, Emma is recognizing more and more that this other character is in fact ridiculous, and that her matchmaking plans for him are going off the rails. Mr. Knightley is like the opposite of a Cassandra figure. Whenever he makes a proclamation about the future, the narrative heeds him. So he's meant to be our Eleanor-like voice of reason, and although he's set up in mild opposition to Emma in this respect, because the narrator thinks very highly of him, their dynamic is designed to be a credit to her as well, because they're well matched intellectually, energetically. It goes back to what I was saying about poor old Northanger Abbey. Although Mr. Knightley highlights Emma's faults unapologetically, it's also in their conversations that her playfulness and cleverness and her genuine good humor are most emphasized. And I found that I was always looking forward to their exchanges, and especially to their arguments. They do have the biggest age difference of any couple. Mr. Knightley is 37 or 38. The narrator's like, who's really counting at that point? And Emma is 21. But pretty soon we're going to be talking about cousins falling in love. So let's spare a thought for Mr. Woodhouse. How can you not? Because he and Emma have an even closer relationship than Elizabeth Bennet and her father, despite the fact that temperamentally, Mr. Woodhouse is much more like Mrs. Bennet. The narrator tells us that although Emma dearly loved her father, he was no companion for her. He could not meet her in conversation, rational or playful. So he's not very bright. He's a hypochondriac. He has very particular needs. But although the narrator's descriptions of him are quite pointed, they don't have the same kind of fangs to them. And maybe that's because Emma cares for him so sincerely. I guess you could say in the end that Mr. Woodhouse is benign and Mrs. Bennet is malignant. 3 final thoughts here. Firstly, Emma's a full character from the start. She's often placed at a disadvantage narratively. She can be a closed-minded snob, and she misinterprets people based on what she wants to see. And so she's humbled. She has several instances of the "till this moment I never knew myself" variety. But she's not a caricature of a spoiled child or even a cautionary tale about bad parenting. Instead, she's an example of some of the subtle, delayed evils of spoiling a good person. And she's a commentary on sometimes not having anything to overcome can stunt someone's character to the point that their own deficiencies then become the thing to overcome. Anybody out there making video essays on Rory Gilmore, this is the Austen book for you. Secondly, this book has such a claustrophobic quality. I've heard some people describe Austen's work in general as claustrophobic, and let me tell you, if you feel that way about like Sense and Sensibility, you're gonna feel that way about Emma. We never leave this small village of small people. There's no London, no Bath, no trips to the seaside or to the Lake District. There's very little variety of scenery or society, and the one character who's extroverted, I mean, you gotta feel for him because the others treat him as a bit of a curiosity. You know that internet famous Pride and Prejudice Amazon review that says just a bunch of people going to each other's houses? The novel of hers that most fits that description is Emma. And that's why I love this bootleg Barnes & Noble edition of it. When I first read this, it was in a different version, and then I saw this copy on my sister's shelf and I was like, that's it. That is the color of this book. It's got this ruddy terracotta feeling, something that's warm and bright, but close. Imagine a room that doesn't have high ceilings that's painted entirely this color, and that's what it feels like to be inside this book. That's why Emma is here in the lineup. It's not exactly subdued, but also it's not exactly lively. Finally, and most importantly, this has what is to me the most romantic ending of all of them, because Mr. Knightley offers to come live with Emma and Mr. Woodhouse at Hartfield. What a moment. This is 200 years ago, and we're talking about a gentleman leaving his inherited estate to live in his wife's domain to help care for his cantankerous father-in-law. And as you get older, you realize that true, long-lasting romance is your partner diligently and cheerfully caring for your aging parents. For you, this is the second to last section, but I outlined it last because in so many ways Mansfield Park is the outlier. It's kind of a weird book from this author. I love it, and I know some people who aren't really that big on the rest of Austen, but who do really like Mansfield Park. But yeah, overall, opinions are mixed. And maybe that's because I don't know anyone who says that Fanny Price is their favorite Austen heroine. Is she yours? Let me introduce you to the Northanger Abbey people. You can all host a perplexing opinions convention. Mansfield Park has the most dramatic setup, and the more I've thought about it, the more impressive it seemed to me. We begin with three sisters who could have had their own book, but instead they're setting up this one. About 30 years ago, Miss Maria Ward of Huntingdon, with only £7,000, had the good luck to captivate Sir Thomas Bertram of Mansfield Park in the county of Northampton, and to be thereby raised to the rank of a baronet's lady, with all the comforts and consequences of a handsome house and large income. So the first Ward sister marries a baronet, the second a reverend, and the third a lieutenant. I absolutely and categorically refuse to say that in the British way. The baronet is wealthy and admired, the reverend is middling and respectable, and the lieutenant is poor and uneducated. And here, like we've seen elsewhere, we have a case where the one who didn't marry for money is in fact the most miserable. That's what makes these tensions between love and money much more interesting in Austen's work than if she consistently favored one over the other. Years go by, and when the two more fortunate women realize that their younger sister has a much larger family than she can afford, they offer to take one of her children into the baronet's home and to raise that child alongside his sons and daughters. They ultimately choose Fanny, who is 10 at the time, and who's described by her own mother as delicate and puny. What this opening chapter does is that it situates you at Mansfield Park before the child herself is situated there. Before ever meeting Fanny, the reader senses how strange and daunting and isolating this change will be for her, and that any sign she gives that she's unhappy will be interpreted as though she's ungrateful. We spend time in Fanny's mind in the next chapter on her arrival, and we can see that the adults and the teenagers around her mostly fail to empathize with her. But this window into her childhood perspective is A, not something that we really get in the rest of Austen's work, and B, not something that was necessarily typical for this era. Mansfield Park was published in 1814. Proust was still 100 years away. The first volume of In Search of Lost Time was published in 1913, and it was a landmark literary work for many reasons, of course, one of which was the way it carefully portrayed the psychology of a child. In the early 19th century, children were still mostly viewed as little adults, without that recognition of their unique, developing minds. So this brief section in Mansfield Park is one that seems pretty normal to us today, but it's actually more notable than you might think. Little Fanny is put in a difficult position by design because it's all based on hypocrisy. Her aunts and her uncle believe that she's inferior to the baronet's 4 children, and they also believe that they have to ensure she stays that way. It's the age-old question, if this were really natural, why would you have to work so hard to maintain it? And then we get our first glimpse of real kindness. It's from Edmund, the baronet's second son, who's 16 at the time that 10-year-old Fanny comes to live with them. One day he finds her crying on the stairs. He sits with her, and when she reluctantly opens up to him and admits that she's homesick, this is how he responds. "You are sorry to leave Mamma, my dear little Fanny, which shows you to be a very good girl, but you must remember that you are with relations and friends who all love you and wish to make you happy. Let us walk out in the park and you shall tell me all about your brothers and sisters." And when she tells him on this walk that she wishes to write to her older brother, whom she's like really close with, Edmund is the one who gets her the paper so that she can write the letter, and then he takes it to his father so he can mail it. Edmund and Fanny's relationship reminds me of a biblical translation I like. In the King James Version of Genesis, it says that God created Eve as a helpmeet for Adam. But in Robert Alter's interpretation, he translates this Hebrew word as God creating Eve to be Adam's sustainer. And that's the best English language distillation I can think of for the feeling of being seen and understood and cared for by another person. Even just having one other person like that transforms your world. And Edmund quickly becomes Fanny's sustainer. We have to talk about Fanny, who is the opposite of Emma Woodhouse in pretty much every way. She openly states at one point, "I can never be important to anyone." She's embarrassed when people compliment her appearance. She's frail and she struggles to even walk for long distances. She's religious and upright, which at times makes her a bit of a stick in the mud. Basically, she thinks of herself as sad and insignificant to those around her. There's nothing that's obviously special about her. Everything about Fanny's characterization is happening on a lower frequency. We're getting narrative murmurs, these small details, like the fact that everyone confides in her because she's the best listener. She's patient with everyone, even with one of her aunts, who's the nastiest character in any of Austen's books. And Fanny is in love with Edmund, which is another reason for this book's relative unpopularity. I mean, even the book itself at the very beginning suggests that it's best if cousins don't become involved. But things being, as they are, Fanny is anxious when a new brother and sister come into town. Their names are Henry and Mary Crawford. Mary sets her sights on Edmund, and Henry ultimately sets his sights on Fanny. And this is where we really see her backbone, because it's the first time she holds to her own principles in opposition to those she loves. There's some piteous weeping from her, and she finds it almost existentially impossible to say no to her uncle and to Edmund. But even though her style isn't emphatic or triumphant, the substance of her refusal is both, because in her own gentle way, Fanny is trying to explain that there's no guarantee that a woman will return a man's affections. Fanny acts like the opposite of many a female character in a romance novel because she knows the rake can't be reformed. She's never convinced. People keep suggesting that it's her business to reform him, and she's like, no thank you. We get several brothers and male cousins in this book, another thing that makes it different, and it was Edmund who helped me take stock and see this pattern of Austen's male leads, that they're all men who notice women and like women. They're attuned to the feelings and interests of others in general. There's not this gendered gap in emotional intelligence. And that goes in the other direction too, because there are a lot of awful male and female characters. I see your strong female character and will raise you an awful female character any day. Edmund is initially presented to us in the vein of Eleanor or Mr. Knightley. He's the book's conscience. His takes represent the narrator's takes. But that doesn't last long when he falls in love. And this change in his relationship with the narrator is what first alerts us to the fact that he's lost his way. The woman in question is Mary Crawford, who's a standout character in the Jane Austen universe because she has most of the qualities of the other book's heroines. We're consistently told how lively she is, to the point that lively starts to feel pejorative. She outmatches Fanny in conversation. She's witty in a way that's often pushing boundaries. But there are these signs that she's spirited in a selfish way. When she meets Edmund's older brother, we're told that she felt an early presentiment that she should like the eldest the best. She knew it was her way. It's an impish wink-wink kind of moment, but the reader's left thinking, is this cute? She openly wishes that Edmund were more fashionable and ambitious. She does connect with him, but she doesn't want to marry a country clergyman. It's interesting, Mary is very self-aware in a lot of ways, but she could never have the experience of, till this moment, I never knew myself. And she can be as much like Elizabeth Bennet as she wants otherwise, but that's disqualifying. She can't be a protagonist. There's this fascinating portion late in the book when Fanny returns to her family's house in Portsmouth for the first time in many years. And she comes to understand that despite her struggles living as a second-class citizen at Mansfield Park, that is her home. We get an extremely negative portrayal of urban squalor, essentially, and the main takeaway is that Fanny is glad she was raised at Mansfield and given the manners and education of her uncle's family. So it's not completely in the mold of a Pygmalion-style tale, because we're not left in doubt as to whether or not it was good for Fanny to be uprooted and to exist between social classes. There are other stories that remain more ambiguous on that point. This is the most overtly moralizing of Austen's books. There are a series of chapters about this theatrical production that the young people want to put on at Mansfield Park, and this is where it became clear to me that all the best lines go to the antagonists. The devil on one shoulder is a lot more compelling than the angel on the other, and that's intentional because there are times when Fanny stands alone and she can't make grand speeches or arguments or try to convince anybody over to her side. That's just not her. She only knows what she feels to be right. But it does lead up to this final chapter that feels both abrupt and sermonizing, and there's so much coyness. Oh my god, like the most blatant examples of a narrator refusing to give us the juicy stuff. So, in the drawbacks column, for some readers at least, we have the delicate and puny protagonist, the seemingly indefinite delays in Fanny's love story, the cousin thing, the rushed ending, and all the moralizing elements. I mean, they're great for analysis, but they're not packaged in a way that's as palatable as they are in most of the other books. But like I said, I have a real soft spot for Mansfield Park, and I think it's a surprisingly compulsive read. We have a real variety of situations and settings and brisk pacing in here, and those qualities are paired with the most complex and consequential social questions that are asked in any of these novels. Everything feels murkier and darker tonally than it does in the earlier books. And though this isn't a romance, it highlights the real fantasy of Austen's novels, which isn't specifically that the characters find love, it's that the characters get exactly what they deserve. This whole time, my outfit choice has been signaling where my heart really lies. I wanted Persuasion to look her best. This has always been the one for me, not just my favorite Austen, but a favorite book in general. Persuasion is her last novel. She wrote it in the final years of her life when she was in very poor health, and it's widely regarded as her most mature book. And there's a sadness to it for all that it's a hopeful story. We begin with a self-satisfied, small-minded father, a favored eldest daughter, and a forgotten middle daughter. Our last first sentence, here we go. Sir Walter Elliot of Kellinchall in Somersetshire was a man who, for his own amusement, never took up any book but the baronetage. There he found occupation for an idle hour, and consolation in a distressed one. There his faculties were roused into admiration and respect by contemplating the limited remnant of the earliest patents. There any unwelcome sensations arising from domestic affairs changed naturally into pity and contempt. Let's be real, it's the worst standalone first sentence, but what's going on here is that Sir Walter is reading the book of his lineage, the book that records the history and rise of the ancient and respectable Elliot family. Sir Walter is a snob. He believes in the ultimate superiority of ancestry. What he's not is practical. We're told that while Lady Elliot lived, there had been method, moderation, and economy which had just kept him within his income, but with her had died all such right-mindedness, and from that period he had been constantly exceeding it. If you're familiar with the technique of figuring out where to start a story by asking yourself, what has changed for my characters? Like, why are we entering this story now? Here's a good example of that. The Elliots have been overspending for a while, but we enter the story at the point when it's no longer sustainable and they have to rent out their home and leave the neighborhood. Sir Walter and his oldest daughter, Elizabeth, think that it's degrading to economize and they would rather leave their home than make a budget. We see relatively little of our protagonist in the first few chapters, and it's a gloomy opening with Sir Walter and Elizabeth because where other characters smile, these ones grimace. Elizabeth Elliot occupies a similar role to Emma Woodhouse. She runs the home, her father dotes on her, but Elizabeth is thoughtlessly conceited. Meanwhile, here's what we learn about the middle daughter. Anne, with an elegance of mind and sweetness of character, was nobody with either father or sister. Her word had no weight, her convenience was always to give way. She was only Anne. This is new for us, for the heroine to be unloved like this by her own family. I mean, even Fanny had her older brother. There's only one other person who values Anne the way she deserves. Her name is Lady Russell. She was a friend of Anne's late mother, and she's a wonderful woman, but her main flaw is that she also has prejudices on the side of ancestry. This matters because 8 years ago, when Anne was 19, Lady Russell convinced her not to marry the man she loves. Frederick Wentworth had no significant fortune or rank. He was going into the Navy, and both Sir Walter and Lady Russell told Anne that she would be throwing herself away on him. Anne was as unassuming then as she is now, so she trusted Lady Russell's judgment that they wouldn't be compatible, that they wouldn't be right for each other. But naturally, Frederick Wentworth interpreted this as Anne thinking he wasn't good enough. And now, this man, 8 years older, with a successful naval career, bold, rich, and super hot, is coming back into the neighborhood at a time when Anne's wasteful family is struggle busing and still has 2 of 3 daughters unwed. It's mortifying. And Anne, before this period, had already learned to rethink and regret her refusal, but it's framed in such a thoughtful way. I mean, you really feel who Anne is in this description. Anne, at 7 and 20, thought very differently from what she had been made to think at 19. She did not blame Lady Russell. She did not blame herself for having been guided by her, but she felt that were any young person in similar circumstances to apply to her for counsel, they would never receive any of such certain immediate wretchedness, such uncertain future good. She had been forced into prudence in her youth. She learned romance as she grew older, the natural sequel of an unnatural beginning. That part has always struck me, how she looks back on these difficult events with compassion for herself and for others. I've always understood Anne as a sort of culmination of our Austen protagonists. She's not the most striking, I would never claim that, but she's the one who unites spirit and gentleness. I was thinking again of a later book, Middlemarch, and how Anne is a Dorothea Brooke-like character whose quiet merits are easy to miss. And it's a kind of test for the other characters to see who recognizes those merits. Here's one of the most emblematic passages when she's visiting with her younger sister's family, and the women are asked to play the piano in the evenings. She played a great deal better than either of the Miss Musgroves, but having no fond parents to sit by and fancy themselves delighted, her performance was little thought of, only out of civility or to refresh the others, as she was well aware. She knew that when she played, she was giving pleasure only to herself. But this was no new sensation. Excepting one short period of her life, she had never, since the age of 14, never since the loss of her dear mother, known the happiness of being listened to. There's that sadness I mentioned. No happy ending can erase somebody having felt this way. Another famous detail about Anne is that she had been a very pretty girl, but her bloom had vanished early. There's some knowing commentary on Elizabeth Elliot and how she mostly looks as handsome as she once did, which is meant to imply that most women in their late 20s are looking worse for the wear. I have what might be an unpopular opinion here. 27 is in the rearview mirror for me, and Anne's age doesn't bother me. It's a signifier from the year 1816. It's probably just a Twitter thing, seeing people have personal crises processing that Anne is considered washed up at age 27. My feeling is, don't involve my girl Anne in your unresolved issues. Get a hold of yourself. I mean, look, it's the Eleanor coming out. But these judgments on aging matter the most when Captain Wentworth comes back into her life. There's an agonizing moment when she's told that he described her to someone else as so altered he should not have known her again. If that happened to me, you wouldn't hear from me and be busily burrowing to the earth's core. And once again, Anne is a bigger person than I am because she's not even petty in her thoughts. Despite these comments from him, she acknowledges to herself that he is looking good. She also overhears him stating that the most important characteristic is firmness, and she knows that he's talking about her, that he still considers her weak for being persuaded to refuse him. Do you by any chance remember that the major Pride and Prejudice scene I mentioned involved a letter? Now, letters play a significant role in that book, but let me tell you, nothing can prepare you for the Persuasion letter and the scene that leads up to it. We've already established that Mr. Knightley owns the corner on everyday romance, but if you like books that make your heart flutter, pitter-patter, grow 3 sizes, Persuasion is the one. Personally, I'm as romantic as an ingrown nail, and still, the first time I read that part, I was screaming. When you're near the end of this book, try not to be in public. you're gonna need a minute. The last time we were in the city of Bath was for Austen's very first book that she wrote, Northanger Abbey, and we returned there only once for this last book. Over a decade ago now, when I visited Bath, I really enjoyed the Jane Austen Museum there, and I'm honestly not that big on literary museums, but there was something about this one. I just think it did a really nice job of contrasting that earlier portrayal of the city with this one. The first is frothy, cynical, but still amusing, right? Versus the Bath in Persuasion, which is uninviting, bleaker, just grayer overall. And that ties in with the general palette of this novel, where even our antagonist is muted. It's funny, this book is noticeably shorter than most of the others, and that's for a combination of reasons. Like with Emma, there are only internal obstacles here for the most part. The external obstacle happened, 8 years ago when Anne was convinced not to marry Frederick. Our antagonist barely plays any kind of a role in the plot, and both our main characters are older and wiser, so there are only so many interactions they can have before they understand each other. I don't think of this as one of Austen's stronger novels on a technical level, and that's partly because it doesn't have that same sense of a full cast. There are still great characters in here, of course there are. I mean, Anne's younger sister Mary is a menace. Like, I've forgotten what a great narrative time she is. And I was drawn this time to Captain Wentworth's sister. She's a naval wife and a good sailor herself, and she objects to men who talk as if women were all fine ladies instead of rational creatures. But there are several characters who are less memorable than any character in Pride and Prejudice or Emma, I would argue. Our focus here is a little narrower. We're venturing into fewer minds, and those minds tend to be more subdued. Even our narrator is less biting in here and the least overtly involved in the story. I mean, there are still cutting lines, but to a different degree. In my eyes, though, it's perfect. It's her autumnal book. I love its depth and sensitivity, its story about second chances, about two people who thought they had learned what there was to learn about themselves, only to gain more knowledge, experience more surprises. It's a book about steadiness and enduring love, and it's one of my enduring literary loves. If you haven't read Jane Austen before or haven't read much of her and you've made it to the end of this video, that's miraculous, honestly. In honor of your staying power, I want to recommend where to start with her books. Now, if one of these has already stood out to you head and shoulders above the others, then search over, start with that one. But if you're still unsure, maybe caught among a few, here are her big four: Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, Emma, and Persuasion. And I'd recommend choosing one of the first pair and one of the second pair. That'll give you a good grounding and a good idea of if and how you want to continue. For me personally, this time around, ranking my favorite to least favorite, I would have to say Persuasion, Mansfield Park, Pride and Prejudice, Emma, Sense and Sensibility, and Northanger Abbey. Thank you for watching. This video has been such a process. I've had the time of my life, and I'll see you soon for another video.